Hi there, and welcome back to week 5. Today we're going to talk about the realm or inhibitors to democracy. These are things that will get in the way of a country successfully transitioning to democracy. So let's start out by looking at 3 different potential paths. These are not mutually exclusive, by the way. Some of these, you can have both of these at the same time. But nonetheless, the first one is what we've been talking about so far with modernization theory. You have economic development. It creates changes in society that Engelhardt and Welzel identify as being important, and it eventually produces democracy in that country. But what if you have a situation where you have economic development, but something gets in the way and prevents those changes in society? Well, the result is going to be authoritarianism, because even though you have economic development, you don't have the necessary human development to accompany it that will eventually lead to democracy. And then finally, you could have economic development that creates the changes of society, but there's something that blocks the transition to a democracy, and that thing, what we're really be talking about, is actors. So the best way to think about this topic is that we're really trying to explain the outliers. We have modernization theory, we have an actor-based theory, but in some cases, modernization is not enough to produce democracy, either because you don't have the societal changes or because actors do various strategic decisions that will prevent democracy from emerging. And we're going to talk about all different scenarios, and we're going to find that it's actually quite complex and nuanced. But that's the basic idea behind what we're talking about this week. First of all, when we talk about inhibitors, there are 3 broad factors that we're going to talk about through this video and also in the course discussions. And I'm going to lay them out here and mention each one briefly, and then we're going to talk about each one of them in turn. So the first is religion. There has been recently a particular emphasis on Islam, and the question is Islam compatible with democracy? Some scholars suggest that it may not be, and other scholars have attempted to answer that question about why Muslim countries tend to be less democratic on average. The second factor is region, and particular emphasis on the Middle East and North Africa, which, by the way, overlaps with religion. And finally is inequality, and there's a particular focus in the literature on oil and natural resources, things like diamonds, minerals, oil, and so forth. And the idea is that inequality could somehow block the development of attitudes and values. If modernization within society occurs as a result of economic development, but you have a situation where all of that economic development, economic wealth that's acquired is concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, well, the mass public doesn't get the benefit, doesn't go through the human development that Engelhardt and Welzel identify, and therefore won't develop the attitudes and beliefs. So those are the 3 main inhibitors that we're going to talk about. There are some others as well that are in the scholarship, but we're going to focus on these because these are the focus of most of the academic literature. First, religion. Let's just state a simple fact, that Islamic population is strongly related to authoritarianism. What that means is that the higher the percentage of a population in a country that is Muslim, the less likely that country is to be democratic. However, as we're going to talk about, the reality is actually much more complex. And the fact is that if you look at these specific countries themselves, look at the regimes, a lot of them that have large Muslim populations are actually secular authoritarian regimes. They're not Islamist regimes. So you have, for instance, the example of Egypt or Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Not saying these were good people at all, but nonetheless, they were Muslim and they governed a large Muslim population, but the regime itself was not a theocracy. So when we talk about Islamists, we're really talking about theocracies like you see in Saudi Arabia or Iran, where if they have not imposed Sharia law specifically, at least Islamic law is a major part of the government law. So there's also, aside from the fact that a lot of the countries with large Muslim populations are actually secular regimes, not Islamist regimes, you also have the world's largest Muslim country, which is Indonesia. It's the 4th largest country in the world and the largest Muslim population in the world as well, and it's considered a very stable, strong, thriving democracy. So let's talk very briefly about Indonesia, again, world's 3rd largest democracy, and the pictures you see here are the president of Indonesia. His name is Joko Widodo, and yes, that is his real name, and yes, that is an awesome name to say out loud. Joko Widodo. Just makes you smile. Joko Widodo. You could do a Marco Polo with it. Anyway, they call him Jokowi. He's actually a heavy metal fan. That's not what you would expect in a heavily Muslim population, a traditional Muslim population. He sort of breaks that stereotype, and Indonesia breaks a lot of stereotypes about the Muslim world as well. For example, as part of their constitution, they officially recognize 6 religions. And what I mean by officially recognize 6 religions, I mean that school children and government workers have the day off for the holidays of all 6 of those major religions. I can tell you, when I was there in 2013, I taught for 2 weeks, and at least 4 days school was canceled to celebrate the holidays of, Buddhist holidays, Christian holidays, not at, when I was there, but, Muslim holidays and so forth. So again, the situation is not nearly as simple as just saying the higher the Muslim population, the less likely you are to have democracy. And moreover, as we're going to find out, outside of the Middle East and North Africa, we abbreviate that to MENA. That's just an abbreviation for Middle East and North Africa. Outside of that, there is no statistical relationship between Muslim population and democracy. So we think there's something unique to the Middle East and North Africa. There's something about this region that just is not, doesn't fit with the other things we know about the world. And I'll also mention one last thing, which is that only about 20% of the Muslim population around the world lives in the Middle East or North Africa. So you see the pie chart, you see that over 60% of Muslims around the world, they live in the Asia Pacific. Now, even if you take Pakistan, which in this graph is classified as Asia Pacific, and you move it into the Middle East category, you still have the vast majority of Muslims around the world that do not live in the Middle East. So while we're going to focus on the Middle East to try to understand why democracy is less likely to exist there, understand that the Middle East is not Islam around the world. It's not representative of Islam around the world because, again, 80% of the Muslim population around the world does not live in the Middle East. Let's turn and focus on region. And again, we're going to focus on the Middle East and North Africa, which absolutely have lower levels of democracy. There are 2 culprits or 2 explanations for why the Middle East and North Africa may have lower levels of democracy. The first is culture. The question is there something unique to this region? We know that is not religion because religion around Islam around the world outside of the Middle East is not related to level of democracy. But is there something about the Arab culture, about the culture in this particular region that could inhibit democracy from developing? And the second, and also related to that, is oil wealth, which really translates into inequality, and we're going to get to that factor next. So let's just stick with culture. This is an actual possibility. As you'll see in some of the studies, people have tried to control for the factors, the other inhibitors that we've been talking about. They'll try to explain level of democracy. They'll control for oil, they'll control for mineral resources, they'll control for Muslim population, they will control for level of modernization. And even after controlling for all of those, there's still something about the Middle East that, on average, this region has lower levels of democracy, even after controlling for all that stuff. So that's actually a possibility, and scholars are still looking into it. I should also note, however, that the studies are rather mixed on this. Most of the studies show that even after you control for all of those other factors, the Middle East, North Africa, it still has lower than average levels of democracy. But some studies using different measures, say of oil wealth or inequality, have found that that relationship goes away. So I don't want to give you the view, or I don't want to give you the impression that the scholarship is united, that there is absolutely something about this region that's unique, but it is, most of the studies do show that there's still a relationship, and we're still trying to figure out why that relationship might exist. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about that with one of the readings. And then finally, let's talk about inequality. You can see from the picture the giant resort, a big wall, and then shacks on the other side. And there's a particular focus on mineral and oil wealth oil because of the Middle East, mineral because of other regions around the world. But the idea is that even though you have economic development, even though a country, generally speaking, becomes very rich, the mass population is still poor. That wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small, wealthy elite class, and the mass public remains very poor. Now, why would inequality be related to level of democracy? Why would that be an inhibitor? There are two explanations. The first one is what we've been talking about. It's a modernization argument. The democratic values and beliefs that result from the development in the societies, they don't form among the mass public because the benefits of economic development, education, literacy, occupational specialization, all of those things we talked about from Lipset through Engelhardt and Welzel, the mass public doesn't experience that because all the wealth goes to the small number of oil barons or the small wealthy ruling class. What that means is that the growth of the expressive values that Engelhardt and Welzel tell us make democracy more likely to develop and create the demand for democracy, those are halted. Those values never get developed and the people remain in what looks like an agrarian or an industrial society, despite the economic growth. So the correlation between economic growth and human development may not exist for every country. There may be countries that have the economic growth, but the human development doesn't follow along. So that's the first argument. The second one is an actor-based argument. And in its simplest terms, this is a gross simplification of a very complex theoretical argument, but basically there's a small wealthy class that like their stuff, and they want to keep their stuff, and they'll resort to authoritarian means to keep their stuff, to maintain their wealth and power. And you can see this picture from Malaysia, which is an authoritarian regime, but is also experiencing, if you go to, this is Kuala Lumpur, I know this because I see the two buildings in the background, I've actually been there. It's an amazing place. But you see this giant economic development right next to these hovels and shacks and people living in really deep poverty, just side by side. And so in these poor areas, these are people that would demand democratization. They would demand changes, but the small wealthy class, they will revert using various means to preventing democracy from developing, preventing the people from rising up and overthrowing the regime. And we're going to talk about some of those mechanisms through this actor-based argument as well. But let's back up before we get to the readings and let's kind of lay this out graphically. We've got three general correlates, things that we know will inhibit the development of democracy. They're correlated with a lower level of democracy regardless of economic development. The first is religion, the second is region, mainly that refers to Islam in the Middle East, and then the last one is inequality, which actually refers to around the world as well. These are three interrelated correlates. What I mean by that is that when we focus on the Middle East as a region, we also have to recognize those countries have the highest Muslim populations in the world, 93, 95% Muslim population. And so when we talk about region, we're also talking about religion. And those countries also have huge amounts of oil wealth and large levels of income inequality. So we're also talking about inequality. All of these things are related, which makes trying to figure out which one of these correlates is the true factor that prohibits democracy from developing very difficult. Some of the readings this week will try to do that as best they can, but I can tell you as a statistician, it's really hard to do. And at this point, we really have not been able to focus on any one of these other than religion. We can pretty much say that Islam is not incompatible with democracy because that statistical relationship only exists inside the Middle East. Again, you go outside the Middle East and there is no relationship between Islamic population and democracy. So religion, we think, is capturing something else. We think it may be capturing inequality or culture or actor-based strategy, but we don't know what that is. Underlying these correlates are several complex causal mechanisms that we've already mentioned, but we're going to go into a little more deeper in the rest of this video, which is, and the main two that we keep coming back to are the modernization argument and the actor-based argument. So with that said, let's dive into the readings. We're going to talk about each one. I'm only going to hit the highlights for a couple of these because I think you can read it and get most of what you need. And once again, I always give the caveat, these videos are not a substitution for actually reading. What we're going to cover in these videos is an overview. It's not everything you need to understand it. So again, I know I've been making that point every video, but it's really important to understand that. Okay, first of all, Ross. Does oil hinder democracy? And the main part of Ross is that there are three possible causal mechanisms that can explain why countries that experience huge economic development that is due to oil or minerals outside of the Middle East as well, why they are less democratic than other countries. And the three causal mechanisms, first one is what's called a rentier effect. Basically, you have a small wealthy elite class. They want to maintain their power, and they do it by having lower taxes on the citizens, and they do it by using what we call patronage, which also includes corruption, by the way. This will not be obvious from the Ross reading, which is why I have these videos to kind of provide some of this background. But when we talk about patronage, we're talking about hiring people whose jobs depend on the goodwill of those wealthy elite ruling class. So, for instance, you can have somebody whose entire family, all of their jobs are dependent on the oil baron being happy with them, and that's a way for the ruling elites to prevent accountability, to prevent the people from rising up, throwing them out of office, taking their stuff, and installing a democracy. So the first one is just that these wealthy elites use this patronage and this corruption to try to keep prominent members of society in their corner and favorable to them and dependent upon them for things like jobs, food, and so forth. So the second causal mechanism is the repression effect, and this is much more straightforward. This basically says that small ruling class has so much money that they can sink it into police force. They can hire a lot of police force, a lot of police officers to protect them and to maintain their rule and their power, and they can provide them with things like bullets and tear gas and all of the equipment that can physically prevent the masses from rising up and demanding democracy. And that hopefully, obviously, is very different from a rentier effect. And then the last one we've already talked about is modernization. Simply put, income inequality prevents the wealth, the education, and all of those human development factors from trickling down and affecting the mass public, which means that the demand for democracy never develops. So last thing about Ross is go through, and the section on causal mechanisms where he lays out the rationale behind each one of these three is really important. Make sure you take good notes on that. That's certainly going to be one of the topics that we're going to discuss in the discussions later this week. The second thing to know is that the method section and the results sections are really dense. I do not expect you to understand what a time series regression model means. So skip that. When you get past the causal mechanisms and you get to that method section where he's talking about data and regression models, go straight to the conclusion to get the main findings, because Ross does us a favor by putting all of the main important findings from the paper right there at the end of the paper in the conclusion section. So just go straight there. But the upshot is that Ross finds that oil and mineral wealth inhibits democracy around the world. In other words, it's not just oil in the Middle East. It's mineral wealth or any type of natural wealth around the entire world that inhibits democracy. So again, this is not isolated to the Middle East, North Africa, and rather importantly, Ross finds support for all three of these mechanisms. In other words, all three of those causal mechanisms might be the real explanation, which means there's not a simple causal factor we can point to and say, aha, this is why countries with a lot of oil or mineral wealth are not democratic. And that's something I want to highlight. I mentioned at the very beginning of class, but there are no simple answers to this stuff. And a lot of this, as a point I'll make at the end of this video, is that a lot of these factors can interact and work within each other at the same time to determine the outcome of a specific country. So let's move on to lust. Missing the third wave. Lust focuses on secular authoritarian rulers in this region, Middle East, North Africa. And in particular, what Lust found is that the secular authoritarian rulers used the fear of Islamists who were promoting political Islam in order to keep the secular Democrats from pushing too far and too quickly for reform. Now let me define a few terms here. As I mentioned, when we talk about Islamists, we're talking about people who promote basically theocracy. They believe that the government should be an Islamic state, not in the same way that ISIS is, but that the secular government, its laws should overlap with Islamic laws. And so these are people, this is what we refer to as political Islam. So you got one group within a country, one set of actors that are promoting political Islam. You've got another set of actors, the people we call secular Democrats. Now, to say they're secular is not to say they're not Muslim. Most of them are. The overwhelming majority of the people we call secular Democrats are devout Muslims and practicing Muslims. What makes them different from the Islamists or those promoting political Islam is that they do not want a theocracy. They want democracy and they want freedom of religion in their country. Even though they may be Muslim, they do not want Sharia law or other Islamist law becoming official government law. But what separates them from the regime is that they also want democracy. The regime is also secular. They're not a theocracy, and let's say Mubarak in Egypt or Saddam Hussein in Iraq, both of them identified as Muslim, but they did not impose Muslim law as the government law. And so they were secular, but they also wanted to maintain their power. They were authoritarians. So you've got these three different actors, the secular authoritarians, the secular Democrats, and those promoting political Islam. And what Lust finds is that in a lot of the countries that had secular authoritarian rulers in the Middle East, they used the fear of political Islam taking over in the country to basically keep the secular Democrats from pushing too fast and too hard for reform, which obviously would lead to less democracy. So if it's not obvious, Lust is providing an actor-based explanation for why there's less democracy in the Middle East, particularly among these secular authoritarian regimes. What that means, again, is that Islam itself does not impede democracy. This is not Islam preventing democracy. This is a secular authoritarian ruler using the fear of political Islam to impede democracy. So a very different, much more nuanced argument than I think what you might expect if you hadn't read Lust or if you weren't exposed to some of this material. Let's move on to Howl. Sorry, as I mentioned before, I'm terrible with names. I'm surprised that I pronounced Lust correctly. I might have mispronounced Lust correctly. I just call it Lust. Anyway, this article looks directly at inequality and democracy, and there are going to be very clear echoes of Jaworski and Lamanji. So keep them in. Yes, I can pronounce Jaworski, but apparently not Hool. Part of that is that I've actually met Jaworski and heard somebody pronounce his name. He wouldn't know who I am, but nonetheless. Sorry for the digression. Back to the reading. So basically what he finds is that inequality does not prevent transition to democracy. So countries that have a lot of inequality are no more likely to transition to democracy, and they're no less likely to transition to democracy than countries that have widespread income equality. However, what this article finds is that inequality does harm survival of new democracies. So if a country transitions to democracy and they have high levels of inequality, then we would expect them to have a higher rate of reverting back to authoritarianism. They're less likely to survive as a democracy. Now, this argument, as Jaworski and Lamanji tried to do, somewhat undermines modernization argument. But only somewhat. Remember the findings by Ross, which are actually not disputed by this article. It may be that oil and mineral wealth are in fact strongly related to or act as an inhibitor of democracy, even if inequality is not the mechanism. It may be that modernization argument might actually be a real factor explaining oil and mineral wealth resources, but that inequality using different measures may not be related to the transition of democracy. So again, some people read this as taking the kneecaps out from Englehart and Welzel, and it's just not true. Finally, we get to Hawkins, and this is actually not necessarily about inhibitors of democracy. It's an actor-based explanation, but the important thing, and what I want you to read, the reason I want you to read this article, is that it provides a really good example of what we're doing in our projects. What Hawkins does is he goes through in Cuba, he focuses on Cuba, and he goes through all of the other theories that might be explanations. He talks about civil society, he talks about modernization, he talks about alternative theories, and he finds that they cannot explain why Cuba is authoritarian. The reason is all of those other theories, based on what we know about Cuban society and Cuban economy, Cuba should have transitioned to become democratic, and it did not. What he finds, however, is that the actors and the role of the Castro regime is what prevented them from transitioning. So the other theories would say it would transition, but the actors intervened in this case to prevent that transition. Again, the most important part of this is that it's very similar to the project where we're looking at a country and we're trying to determine, okay, which theory does explain this country or which theory does not. It is the least important reading this week. If you absolutely cannot do all of the readings, then this is one that you should skim as opposed to the others, but it also has a couple of really important sections, which is this structural pressures and democratizing actors and the explaining the absence of social groups and softliners, where Hawkins uses the O'Donnell and Schmitter book and their theory about softliners and hardliners to explain the lack of development or the lack of transition to democracy. And again, I just wanted you to read this because it's one of the clearest examples of where a scholar is saying that actors, in addition to all the other stuff we've been talking about, inhibitors to democracy, actors can often also be an inhibitor to democracy. So that's the overview of the readings. Let's wrap this up, just give the upshot, which is that several factors can inhibit democracy. There's a simple set of correlates that we've been talking about: religion, region, and inequality. But again, hopefully by now you see that there's very complex and nuanced causal mechanisms underlying them. Modernization, actors' theories, those are the two we keep coming back to. But there's some others as well, such as, and it is an actor-based theory, but it isn't rooted in O'Donnell and Schmitter, but the reading about secular authoritarian regimes using the threat of political Islam to prevent more rapid reform by the secular Democrats within the Middle East. These things overlap, and often these factors can combine to influence specific countries, as we see in the Middle East, which is the clearest example of a lot of these factors coming together. That's, if you're wondering why I focus so much on the Middle East, it's because it highlights the problem we have with trying to locate any one factor as the explanation for why a country or a set of countries are less democratic. So again, this is stuff you have to think about. This is not easy material. It's not conceptually easy. It's really complicated, and you have to think about all of these different factors at the same time. And one last thing, just to foreshadow for next week, notice that much of what we've been talking about, these factors, also explain democratic survival, what we call consolidation. And that's going to be the topic next week. We've now come to the end of the material that covers the explanations and the theories for why countries transition to democracy or fail to transition to democracy. What we're going to look at next week is, once a country becomes democratic, how likely is it to survive? How likely is it to stay democratic for a long time, 10, 20 years? And how likely is it to revert back to authoritarianism? So again, some of these same explanations, modernization, inequality, are actually more powerful explanations of consolidation and survival than they are transition to democracy. But we're also going to add a couple of new ones next week. The point is, don't forget the literature that we've covered. We're not leaving modernization, actors, or inequality behind. Those are explanations, also for consolidation and survival. We're going to add a couple of new ones on top of that, and the two that we're going to focus in on are presidential versus parliamentary systems. We believe that the type of government, whether it's a presidential system or a parliamentary system, can either promote or undermine new democracies. And also, we're going to look at economic downturns. That is one of the best predictors of a new democracy reverting to authoritarianism, is if they have an economic crisis. Because, again, let's go back to the very beginning of class, to that Jorah Mormont quote to Daenerys Targaryen, which is, a common people pray for rain, healthy children, and a summer that never end. It is no matter to them if the High Lords play their Game of Thrones. Well, that's true as well for new democracies. If you have a new democracy, people think that all of a sudden the country is going to fart puppy dogs and rainbows, and it's just not so. If the people in a democracy that just transitioned from authoritarian rule, if they're starving, if they're unemployed, if they can't take care of their families, they're not going to be so hot on democracy. And authoritarianism that promises economic prosperity is going to be a lot more attractive to them. So we're going to talk about those factors as well, and that's the end of this video. Hope it wasn't too painful, and see you in the discussion.